I'll be talking to you about corruption, KYC, and the cost of compliance. The reason I did this talk is because I think a lot of us intuitively probably reject KYC, but often people don't really go too much deeper into understanding like why maybe that is the case. And I wanted to present some information to you in a sort of narrative form. I hope you enjoy. Oh, yeah. All right. So, pay attention to the date. September 10th, 2001. Donald Rumsfeld, the Defense Secretary of the Pentagon, held a press conference where he basically outlined that $2.3 trillion in transactions by the Department of Defense could not be accounted for. In fact, he went on to say that the adversary is actually closer to home. It is not terrorism per se, but the Pentagon bureaucracy. Pretty bold statement. Now, the following year, Jim Minery basically traveled to the United States of America trying to track down just $300 million of this spending. He knows it's gone, but they could not find where they spent it on. Fast forward until 2015, I recall correctly, Catherine Austin Fitts, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Housing Department of Housing and Urban Development, found that her department, along with the Pentagon, had in that year $6.5 trillion of unaccountable adjustments for that 1 year, right? This was 54 times the approved budget for the Pentagon for that year, which was $122 billion. Now, Mark Skidmore of MSU thought that she made a mistake or a typo and thought, well, perhaps she meant $6.5 billion, right? So he got together with her and did their own independent inquiry into this, and what they found was quite shocking, to be frank. During the period of 1998 to 2015, there was $21 trillion unaccounted for, or $1 trillion average per year, which this money was just going into the ether. Nobody knows what was spent on, or how much, and so on. Now, of course, none of this would actually be new to Frank C. Spinney, who was probably the first whistleblower on the rampant spending of these government agencies. In 1983, he even went on to say that the books are cooked routinely year after year. Now, you might think that that's been stymied, and we've addressed that. I mean, after all, we announced this problem, or the Pentagon announced this problem in 2001. We've had 20 years to do it. Unfortunately, it is still going on, right? Just recently this year, $8.2 billion have improperly valued material has disappeared into the Ukraine. Now, Senator Chuck Grassley has spent a majority of his time as a senator and his political career tracking this kind of government fraud. And he says when it comes to catching fraud, the Department of Defense internal controls are a complete failure, and we've known it for decades. And there he is looking quite grumpy about it. Quick. Now, how does this happen, right? Like, where does this money come from? Well, you might be tickled to find out that this happens through the oldest living program that is still running today. It's written in COBOL, and it's called MOCUS. MOCUS is basically established for doing tendering for the government, but what it also happens to do is find unspent money in other government programs, right? This is completely illegal for any other governmental agency to do, so it's a wonder why it applies to the DoD. Now, to put this in proportion, right? On the left-hand side here, we have what we've just been talking about, the sort of average of the Pentagon's annual unaccounted adjustments at roughly $1.2 trillion, or if you wanted to adjust it to inflation for today, it's approximately $2.4 trillion, right? Now, on the right-hand side, we have the United Nations estimate for illicit financial flows, right? They have basically a 2 to 5% of the global GDP they estimate is involved with illicit financial flows. So the lower bound for that is $1.6 trillion, and the upper bound is roughly $4 trillion. The inner circle there is from the NASDAQ 2024 report, where they say that their estimate for 2023 illicit financial flows was roughly around $3.1 trillion, right? So just to give you a sense of proportion, illicit financial flows, one government agency. Okay, so the day after Donald Rumsfeld's press conference, where he basically announced to go after the Pentagon bureaucracy, we had, unfortunately, 9/11. This spurred on the establishment of the Patriot Act, in which it includes policies related to KYC and AML, specifically sections 311, 326, 351, and 352. It's been a while since I looked at this slide, but I mean, basically, this establishes an authority, it sets forward the standards, it makes anyone who is reporting on this immune to liability for doing so, and then outlays the anti-money laundering programs for the respective countries' financial institutions to implement. Okay. The other thing here is that a month after, the Financial Action Task Force actually recommended 8 of their 9 special recommendations in addition to the Patriot Act policies. What the? All right. Okay, so when those towers fell, not only do we implement surveillance capitalism and start having our surveillance in terms of like our freedom of speech, but we also had the implementation over our financial surveillance as well. In fact, it reverberated around the entire world and landed in Asia. According to a LexisNexis Risk Solutions report, the true cost of anti-money laundering compliance survey in 2015, now, while local regulations were cited as the most frequently of having the greatest impact, it was US regulation embodied by the Patriot Act that was cited as most frequently overall by respondents, followed by European regulation, right? This is the US hegemony implementing these things or you know, strongly suggesting they should be implemented around the world. Not directly tied to the Financial Action Task Force, but of course, you know, anybody helps. So, we could conjecture that the hypothesis for implementing, or the narrative for implementing this sort of financial surveillance or KYC and AML could be justified through terrorism financing, right? On this side here, you already know it. Can you see the amount that is being estimated for financing terrorism globally? No? How about now? Oh yeah. There we go. $11.5 billion in terrorism financing according to our best estimates of last year, right? Again, this is from the NASDAQ Global Financial Crime Report. Pretty small that we sold out our civil liberties for. Now, this is not to disparage, I'm not trying to say that, you know, terrorism is cool or anything. Obviously, it's a real problem, right? Like, I think it should be addressed. But what I'm trying to convey is a sense of proportionality towards it. I hope you understand that. Now, $11.5 billion, I mean, it's still a lot of money. It's quite large. But maybe I was like, well, okay, maybe it was justified, you know, 24 years ago when they implemented this. But if you go look at that, you find that the World Bank and IMF estimated the annual flows towards terrorist organizations was less than $500 million, right? Somewhere between 300 million and 500 million. In 2005, the RAND study estimated Al-Qaeda's annual budget was between 30 to 50 million. The US Department of Treasury in 2015 said that ISIS generated approximately 1 billion annually from various sources. And in 2016, we can see that Europol said ISIS had an annual budget of around 2 billion, right? The sort of dominant threats that we're talking about. Now, in contrast, according to a Stimson study group on counterterrorism spending, that came out to roughly $2.8 trillion between the period of 2002 and 2017. That's an average of $186 billion per year. So to contrast that with $11.5 billion, we're talking like 16 times the amount of money put in towards counterterrorism than the amount that's put into, financing terrorism. That's a pretty good margin, pretty good business, if you own both sides. So, oops. I said a list of financial flows quite a few times. What are they? Well, there isn't actually a consensus or agreed upon definition, but generally speaking, we're talking about IFFs as they relate to tax evasion, multinational tax avoidance, the theft of state assets, and the laundering of proceeds of crime, right? They cover a broad range of market and regulatory abuses, including corruption, drug smuggling, and human trafficking, right? So obviously this is important. I'm, again, not trying to belittle these. It's just a sense of proportion. Now, addressing these issues is important, right? According to Donato, he believes that every dollar that's invested into crime then begets more crime, right? Bjorn Lomborg got together with the top economists to basically prioritize the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and tried to compare them dollar for dollar. There's a great book, Prioritizing the Development, which he goes into a lot of this, and they did find that illicit financial flows is one of the top priorities when it comes to UN's SDGs. So why are IFFs important, right? So from one hand, there's a humanitarian aspect, right? Like drug trafficking and human trafficking are obviously crimes against humanity. We don't want those to happen, ideally. So there is a humanitarian component to it. But the financial aspect can be basically boiled down to lost GDP, right? And if there's lost GDP, then you have lost tax revenue, which means that you have poor quality of governance, is basically what the argument boils down. IFFs are basically associated with ineffective state functioning, illegitimate use of state power, and I forget what I meant by international problems, but it's an international problem, right? So you might solve for illicit financial flows within your own nation state or your own country, but if another country is offering an arbitrage opportunity on that regard, then you can expect capital flows to move towards certain regions. It's not entirely true either, because actually when it comes to capital abuses, like you can also view taxation as a capital abuse, and so you can find like legitimate means of financial flows moving towards restrictions where capital is respected. And banking secrecy laws that you would find, say, in Switzerland, for example, are a prime example of this. In fact, you'll find a lot of tax havens actually have very high quality of governance, because you can't provide those kinds of laws if you have forms of corruption, because if you are sending large amounts of capital there, you want to have assurances that it's not going to disappear, right? Or you'll still have private property rights over it. Anyway. So what exactly are illicit financial flows? And that depends. Because like the definition, there is no consensus around the methodology for understanding illicit financial flows. Part of the reason is because the secrecy that's involved, right? If you can't directly estimate what they are, then like you have to kind of find indirect means or models to understand or at least guess what those illicit financial flows are. On one side, basically you have 30% going towards criminal activities, whatever that means, 5% towards corruption, 65% towards trade misinvoicing. In fact, 80% towards trade misinvoicing in the cardamom model, right? And 20% towards corruption. So what is trade misinvoicing? This is what multinational corporations do. Say if they're doing natural resource extraction in a developing country, they will probably fake the costs that are associated with the extraction of that resource and the value of the resource that they extract as they do import and export into another nation, right? And through that, that is where at least these models estimate the majority of illicit financials to originate from. The NASDAQ one accounts 12% towards human trafficking, 25% towards drug trafficking, and 63% towards pretty much everything else, right? Fraud, corruption, and so on. So, now, even though it was 2001 when like KYC and follow the money methods were basically forced as a policy issue, the notion of illicit financial flows didn't really come onto the stage until 2015 through Raymond Baker, and particularly him shilling his book, Capitalism, Achilles' Heel, in 2005, right? In fact, Peter Roeder is quite critical of this because all of the information is, or assumptions that are made based on prescience. And again, here highlighting the same problem from the anti-money laundering and its effectiveness paper. Although different measures and models are used to estimate money laundering, no model can quantify money laundering is globally acceptable. Right? It's an incredibly difficult problem. Which is why follow the money methods are kind of like the first thing to try and attempt to capture, right? Like the idea is if you can have like a full understanding or remove the privacy constraints around capital flows, then you'll be able to do something about it, right? This is the same slide. Now, the interesting thing is even the Financial Action Task Force methodology for assessing compliance with their FATF recommendations and the effectiveness also lacks any hard means of actually understanding that. They point to general crime statistics, very anecdotal evidence, and so on, right? Subjective conclusions. So it's really, really vague we're talking about. Now, to their credit, the United Nations has, yeah, am I doing this or, yeah, okay. Had this UNC TAG pilot program, which is still running right now, where they're working with a variety of developing countries to actually try and capture the most official or best source of illicit financial flows. And we're largely talking about drug trafficking here, in which probably the most noteworthy one is cocaine trafficking in terms of inward flows of $1.5 billion over 2 years. So, like it's worth like keeping that also in a sense of proportion. If we're talking about like $11.5 billion towards terrorism financing, it's like 10 times less. So, are follow the money methods effective, right? We've been running them for 2.5 decades nearly. Well, according to the Financial Action Task Force last year, less than 1% of global illicit financial flows is recovered, right? According to Ronald Paul, anti-money laundering policy intervention has less than 0.1% impact on criminal finance. 0.1, right? And according to the United Nations, they believe it's roughly around 0.2%. Now, that's not a lot. In other words, 99.8% of illicit financial flows are ineffective. Now, this is a problem. And the problem is because when you start looking at what you can measure, and that is the costs of compliance, right? According to LexisNexis, in the United States alone, for banks alone, for 1 year, we're talking about $26.5 billion in just compliance costs, right? That is more than double the global terrorism financing in just America. That's huge. In fact, Ronald Paul goes to say compliance costs exceed recovered criminal funds more than 100 times over. And banks, taxpayers, and the ordinary citizens, me and you, are the ones who get penalized, right? All of those costs get pushed onto us. In fact, this has been known for a while. In the B20 and the OECD, they've known that the challenges have existed with the unintended consequences of financial regulation. They've been highlighted time and time again. In fact, in traditional trade finance, roughly 60% of the costs, or more than half the price, is associated with extra fees, which is a large percentage of is compliance, and that's charged directly towards you. So, why does this matter, right? Well, there's according to institutional economics, if you can reduce the transaction costs, and I'm talking in the abstract sense, right? You know, if you go to the DMV or whatever, that's it, and you're waiting in line for governing services, that's a transaction cost, right? If you can reduce that by 0.1%, you can enable a country to quadruple its wealth. That's the difference between Argentina and Switzerland, right? So we're probably better off creating much more efficient institutions than we are trying to solve this problem directly, or at least in the manner that we're trying to solve it right now. Michael Levy in Money for Crime and Money from Crime says that no one could rationally think that AML controls in general or financial investigation in particular will solve organized crime, right? Completely, or eliminate high-level offending. For there to even be a chance to achieve that, there would need to be a step change in transparency and effective action against high-level corruption along all possible supply chains, right? And this is really important, this high-level corruption, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute, hopefully. Okay, starting to paint a bit of a picture here. I hope you're still with me. Now, there are a whole bunch of other secondary effects that are associated with Financial Action Task Force recommendations, right? In fact, it leads to rushed laws. So one of the sort of secondary effects of being included or excluded from this regime is that if you do not implement the recommendations within the time period, then you'll be economically locked out from the global financial system as a country, right? Which has a massive effect on your economy, as you can imagine. Now, this means that certain laws end up getting rushed through their parliaments, if they have them. And that means you create bad law. And that bad law can then be used to exploit for political gain. Amnesty International has a great report called Weaponizing Counterterrorism. I recommend you read it, in which they show how these recommendations have, and their implementations of their law have been used to target protesters, journalists, and academics, human rights activists, and students. And they've been doing it since 2010, right? Furthermore, I pressed it twice. Okay, Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a very respectable think tank. It's been around for roughly a century, if I recall correctly. They also document this on a broader scale. However, they focus on predominantly authoritarian regimes. Whether you consider India to be an authoritarian regime or not, I personally don't, but the point is that it's much broader than authoritarian regimes. Okay. Anyway. So, what I'm trying to say here, what Alex Cobham says, is international financial flows are actually an elite phenomenon, right? They are the ones who have the incentives, the capital, to implement or not implement these laws. In fact, they are above the laws when it comes to this. So they are able to transfer this money, but at will, beyond the requirements, yet for all of us, we are beholden to these laws. I was going to talk about Jamie Dimon running out of time, but JP Morgan Chase basically was antagonistic towards crypto, criminals, drug traffickers, and money laundering, blah, blah, blah. He wants to shut us all down. Now, the irony of that is that I think in the following months, he was charged, or JP Morgan was charged for $39 billion for a bunch of abuses that are related to illicit financial flows that go all the way back to 2003. And in fact, it's not exclusive to JP Morgan Chase. In fact, almost all of the major banks are involved in these kind of shenanigans, as documented in the FinCEN files. Now, I also, on this slide, Financial Secrecy Index, I think it's worth looking at the United States, and particularly the global scale weight, 25.78%, right? In contrast to Switzerland, less than 4%, right? The US is by far the largest harbor for financial secrecy. I mean, okay, so, and Peter Roeder continues this sort of like thread of thought. Asking a kleptocratic state to create an effective AML system is like asking the fox to create a better henhouse. It is the governing political elite that benefits the most substantially from the weakness of existing system and controls. This is all about government trust. Government trust is declining. There was a graph from Bloomberg here. You know, wherever you look, right? If it's the UK, any OECD country, it's declining. In fact, on a global scale, the average public trust in governments is just 41%. We have a massive kleptocratic and corruption problem. Yep, same thing, different data source. Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you're all aware, government debt is growing. And will become unsustainable in the next 25 years as of 2011, so we're pretty deep into that. Since the 1800s, countries with the same debt to GDP ratio as the US and other countries have defaulted, so we're pretty close to that, and that's according to the CBO. These challenges are global, according to the National Intelligence Council. It's not just the US, it's almost every developed country, and obviously developing countries are associated through their economies. I won't go into that, but the FATF has a form of sovereignty, actually I guess I will, has a form of sovereignty that is quite interesting because it's comprised of their member states, right? So they're in Paris, they're not beholden to France, they're in the OECD building, they're not beholden to OECD, and basically it's member state responsibility, and you need consensus from all these member states that are involved. That's a huge problem. All right, so why does any of this matter? Why do I care about it? Well, it's because of this report that I read in from 2006 from the World Bank, Where is the Wealth of the Nations, right? They find that human capital, and more importantly, the value of institutions as measured by the rule of law, constitute the largest share of wealth in virtually all countries. And so when we're thinking about KYC or follow the money methods or even compliance, my argument would be we should be focusing on creating more efficient parallel institutions, right? Ones that actually unlock capital for people, because this is going to lift more people out of poverty, create a higher quality of life, and we can retain our privacy. Anyway, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.